Graveyard shifts at the Obsidian Oasis are basically babysitting rich people's bad decisions, while fighting a printer smelling of burning ozone. I was mid-wrestle with a jammed receipt when the lobby doors hissed open. In stomped a mountain of a man in a rumpled suit costing more than my car. He looked like a homeless male model, jawline sharp enough to cut glass, eyes bloodshot, radiating an aura, screaming, "I'll sue the sun for being too bright." "Turn it off," he rasped, his voice vibrating in my chest. "The tank, the buzzing, make it stop." I didn't look up from the jam. "Listen, pal, I don't care how late the delivery is. We don't take drop-offs after 2. I snatched a $100 bill from my tip jar and slapped it against his rock-hard chest. "Go to the kitchen, find the carafe, bring me a black coffee, and you can keep the change. Now move." The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous. He tilted his head back and let out a roar so primal the fish tank cracked. Defensive reflex is a funny thing. I didn't scream. I just grabbed my 6-cell mag light and swung. Clonk. The Alpha King hit the plush carpet like a felled oak. I stared at his handsome, unconscious face and exhaled. No tip is worth this.
Welcome back, wolf lovers! Before we dive into tonight's story, a huge thank you to everyone who has been supporting the channel. Your comments and likes mean the absolute world to me. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a night of swoon-worthy romance. Tonight, we're diving into a world of primal tension, where an Alpha King who is used to everyone obeying him meets his ultimate match. It's grumpily meets sunshine, forced proximity at its absolute best. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single second. Are you ready to see what happens when an alpha decides to take a mate instead of a tip? Grab your favorite blanket, get cozy, and let's dive right in. Don't forget to let me know your favorite moment in the comments below. And if you love the story, leave a quick like to help the channel grow. Enjoy!
Chapter 1. I stared at the mountain of muscle currently indenting my expensive lobby carpet, and for a second, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the wall clock. My bad left knee gave a sympathetic throb, a sharp reminder that I wasn't exactly built for body disposal. I'd just knocked out a man who probably owned several small countries, or at least the suits they were made in, with a flashlight that was currently vibrating in my sweaty palm. "Great, Tess," I hissed at the empty air. "First you're the underpaid Night Auditor, now you're a federal fugitive." I couldn't leave him there. If corporate saw the footage of me clonking a VIP before I could scrub the server, I'd be back to living in my car. Gritting my teeth against the familiar grinding ache in my patella, I grabbed him by the lapels of his designer jacket. He was heavy, ridiculously heavy, like he was carved out of dense, stubborn oak. I hauled, heaved, and cursed my way across the marble floor, dragging him toward the back office. By the time I dumped him onto the small, faux leather sofa, my knee was screaming, and I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon uphill. I stood over him, my chest heaving, the industrial-strength LED lights of the office reflecting off his unnervingly handsome face. Even unconscious, he looked intense. His skin felt like it was radiating enough heat to boil an egg. I reached for the first aid kit, pulling out a packet of lavender-scented hand sanitizer, my ritualistic defense against the smell of resort guests, and slathered it on. Suddenly, those bloodshot eyes snapped open. I jumped back, my hip hitting the desk with a painful thud. He didn't roar this time. He didn't even move. He just sat there, frozen, his nostrils flaring as he took a long, shaky breath of the air, specifically the air around me. "You," he rasped, his voice low and jagged like he was swallowing gravel. "Me," I snapped, raising the maglite again just in case. "And don't even think about it. You're lucky I don't call the police. You were being a public nuisance. A loud one." He ignored my threat. He leaned forward, his forehead creasing in a look of sheer, bewildered shock. He wasn't looking at the flashlight. He was looking at me like I'd just offered him the secret to eternal life. He reached up, touching the spot where I'd brained him, but he wasn't wincing. "The buzzing," he whispered, his eyes searching mine with a terrifying focus. The hum. The electricity in the walls, and it's all... He trailed off, his gaze drifting around the room before snapping back to me. He looked... peaceful? No, that wasn't it. He looked like a man who had been drowning and had suddenly found an oxygen tank. The aggressive, jagged energy he'd walked in with had smoothed out into something else. Something quiet and dangerously concentrated. "It's gone," he breathed, the sound almost lost in the hum of the air conditioner. "The concussion?" I asked, my voice dripping with cynicism. "Yeah, that'll do it. Usually comes with a side of blurred vision and a lawsuit I'd really like to avoid." He stood up, towering over me in the cramped office. My knee buckled slightly and his hand was there instantly, steadying my elbow with a grip that felt like molten lead. He didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his chest nearly brushing my shoulder, his head tilting down toward the crook of my neck where the lavender scent was strongest. 10 years, he muttered, his voice vibrating through my skin. For 10 years, the world has been a riot of noise. But here, with you... He took another deep, shuddering breath, his eyes closing as he leaned into my space. "It's finally quiet." I stared up at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. He wasn't just a disgruntled guest anymore. He was looking at me like I was the only thing standing between him and total madness. "Okay, look, Giddy, or whatever your name is," I started, trying to push him back. "I'm glad I cured your headache or whatever, but the lobby doesn't audit itself. You need to leave." He didn't move. In fact, he tightened his grip on my arm, his eyes snapping open with a flash of gold that definitely wasn't in the employee handbook. "No," he growled, the sound low and possessive. "I'm not going anywhere." Chapter 2. The air in the office was suddenly 3 sizes too small. Gideon was still holding my arm, and the heat radiating from his palm was so intense it felt like he'd been marinating in a toaster. It wasn't a normal, human-had-a-light-jog heat. It was a biological furnace. My skin prickled where he touched me, and for a terrifying second, I thought I might actually melt into the carpet. "I'm not going anywhere," he repeated, his voice dropping an octave until it was a low-frequency hum that vibrated right through my bad knee. "Great, fantastic, you're a squatter," I snapped, trying to shake his hand off. "Look, Mr. 100 Roar, you've got 2 seconds to let go before I start making very loud, very expensive noises involving the police." Gideon didn't let go. If anything, his fingers tightened. Not enough to bruise, but enough to remind me that he could probably snap a telephone pole like a toothpick. His gaze was fixed on the crook of my neck, his nostrils flaring with every breath. He looked like he was trying to inhale my entire existence. "The clock," he whispered. "It stopped." I blinked, glancing over at the analog wall clock I'd bought for $5 at a garage sale. The second hand was still ticking away with its rhythmic plastic snick, snick, snick. "No, it didn't. It's right there, doing its job. Unlike you." "I can't hear it," he said, and the wonder in his voice was almost sad. "For the first time in a decade, I can't hear the gears grinding. I can't hear the ants in the floorboards. I can't hear the blood rushing through your veins like a damn waterfall. All I hear is silence." I felt a pang of something that definitely wasn't sympathy. It was probably just caffeine-induced heart palpitations. "Look, misophonia is a real bummer. I get it. Buy some earplugs. But you can't just occupy my office because I have a quiet aura." "It's not an aura," he growled, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer. "It's biological. Whatever pheromones you're putting off, or maybe it's that wretched lavender poison you're wearing, it's dampening my nervous system. You're a human sedative, Tess." "Oh, thanks. I'll add human Xanax to my LinkedIn," I muttered. I reached for the landline on the desk, my fingers inches from the security button. "Last chance. Off the sofa, out of the office, and back to whatever penthouse you crawled out of." Gideon's hand shot out. Before I could even blink, his palm came down on the phone. There was a sickening crunch of plastic and electronics. The handset didn't just break, it imploded. Bits of the keypad skittered across the desk like oversized confetti. I stared at the ruins of the phone. Then I looked at him. "That cost $40, I whispered, my voice trembling with a very specific kind of graveyard shift rage. "And I have to fill out a 3-page incident report for every piece of broken equipment." "I'll buy you the company," Gideon said, dismissively waving a hand at the wreckage. "I'll buy the building. I'll buy the entire block. Just stay still." My survival instinct, which had been taking a nap, finally woke up and screamed. I didn't have my flashlight. It was still on the floor by the desk. But I did have the heavy-duty swing-line stapler. I snatched it up, clicking it open and pointing the business end directly at his face. "Stay back!" I yelled. "I have 200 staples and a very itchy trigger finger. One more step and I'm tacking your eyebrows to your hairline." Gideon froze. He looked at the stapler, then back at me. A slow, dark smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. A look of pure, unadulterated amusement that made my stomach do a nervous backflip. "You're going to staple an Alpha King?" he asked, his voice dripping with dark honey. "I've stapled worse things than you, Giddy. I once had to fix a guest's hem while she was still wearing the dress. I have no soul left to lose." He took a step forward, the stapler inches from his nose. The heat coming off him was a physical wall now. "Do it," he challenged, his eyes flashing that weird, biological gold again. "Staple me. If it means I get to stay in this room for another hour of silence, I'll let you use the whole box." I hesitated. The power imbalance was staggering. He was a mountain of muscle and primal instinct, and I was a woman with a bad knee and office supplies. But as I looked into his exhausted, bloodshot eyes, I realized he wasn't joking. He was truly, utterly desperate for a moment of peace. And then, the heavy office door creaked open. "Tess?" a voice called out. It was my manager, Mr. Henderson, a man who lived for corporate compliance and hated unauthorized visitors more than he hated joy. "I heard a noise. Is everything—" Henderson stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the destroyed phone, the massive, half-undressed man towering over me, and me, holding a stapler like a tactical weapon. "Tess," Henderson said, his voice reaching a pitch only dogs could hear. "What is a VIP guest doing in the back office? And why are you trying to office supply him to death?" Chapter 3. "It's a team-building exercise?" I offered, slowly lowering the stapler. Henderson's face went from pale to a very vibrant shade of "I'm firing you" purple. A team-building exercise. With Mr. Gideon Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Logistics, the man who is currently paying 3 times the standard rate to stay in our soundproof wing? Gideon didn't miss a beat. He smoothed down his rumpled jacket, though he didn't move an inch away from me. The proximity was still there, that heavy magnetic pull that made the air feel like it was humming. "Your employee was merely demonstrating the structural integrity of your office equipment, Henderson." "He broke the phone," I added, pointing a finger at Gideon. "With his bare hands, like a barbarian." Gideon shot me a look that was half warning, half admiration. I was startled. The ringing was excessive. Henderson looked like he was about to have a stroke. "Mr. Thorne, I am so deeply sorry. Tess she's new. She's eccentric. I'll have her escorted out immediately." "No," Gideon interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Actually, I find her methods intriguing. In fact, I've decided that my current suite is insufficient for my needs." I narrowed my eyes. "Oh? Found a spider? Or did the silence of the soundproof wing get too loud for you?" Gideon ignored my sass, focusing entirely on Henderson. "I require a more hands-on understanding of how this resort operates during the night. I will be staying here, in the lobby, as an observer." "An observer?" Henderson stammered. "Sir, we have a lounge for that. We have a bar." "I will be assisting Tess," Gideon said, and the words felt like a physical weight dropping into the room. "I've always wanted to learn the intricacies of the night audit. I let out a bark of laughter before I could stop myself. You? Assisting me? You can't even use a phone without pulverizing it. You probably think a spreadsheet is something you put on a bed. Gideon's jaw tightened. I have managed international logistics for 15 years, Tess. I think I can handle a front desk computer. Fine, I said, a wicked idea forming in my sleep-deprived brain. If he wanted to stay near me to use me as a biological white noise machine, he was going to earn it. But the Obsidian Oasis has strict labor policies, Henderson. We can't have unauthorized observers behind the desk. If he stays, he's a trainee. Unpaid. Henderson looked like he wanted to cry. Tess, you can't be serious? I'm very serious, Gideon said, his eyes locked on mine. He was challenging me now. Give me the badge. 10 minutes later, Henderson had scurried off to find a trainee name tag, leaving me alone with the Alpha King in the lobby. I reached into the supply drawer and pulled out a bright neon yellow vest we usually saved for the valet drivers. Put it on, I said, tossing it at his broad shoulders. Gideon caught it, looking at the polyester fabric like it was a biohazard. You're joking. Corporate policy, Giddy. Safety first. If you're going to be my assistant, you need to be visible, especially since you're so large. I don't want guests tripping over you in the dark. He growled, a real chest-deep sound that made the pens on the desk rattle. But he slipped the vest on. It was hilariously tight across his chest, the seams groaning under the strain of his muscles. Then he pinned the trainee badge to his lapel. It looked absurd against his $4,000 suit. Good, I said, popping my knee as I sat back in my ergonomic chair. Now, trainee, the printer is jammed again. There's a ream of paper in the basement. It's dark, it's damp, and the elevator is acting up. Have fun. Gideon leaned over the desk, his face inches from mine. The scent of him, something like cedarwood and rain-drenched earth, swirled around me, making it hard to focus on the jammed printer. You're enjoying this, he whispered. More than I can possibly describe, I whispered back. Careful, Tess, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky rasp. I might be your trainee for now, but wolves have a very long memory for who put them in neon polyester. He turned and headed toward the basement door, his gait smooth and predatory even in the ridiculous vest. I watched him go, feeling a strange, fluttery tension in my chest that I told myself was just the third cup of coffee kicking in. I settled into my work, the silence of the lobby feeling different, more focused. But 20 minutes later, the silence was broken by a sound that made my hair stand on end. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a growl. It was the sound of Gideon's voice coming through the intercom system, amplified, distorted, and sounding absolutely lethal. Tess, he panted, the sound of his heavy breathing filling the lobby. There's something down here, and it's not the paper. I didn't think. I just grabbed my maglite and bolted toward the basement door, my bad knee screaming a protest with every step. My fear of the dark was a living, breathing thing, but the idea of Gideon, the man who looked like he could punch a hole through a tank, sounding worried was enough to override my cowardice. I burst through the door and onto the landing, the industrial beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Gideon? If you're trying to prank me, I swear to God I will staple your... I stopped. Gideon was standing in the middle of the supply room, but he wasn't being attacked by a monster. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. He was huffing, taking deep, aggressive breaths of the dusty air. What are you doing? I demanded, my heart hammering. You sounded like you were being murdered. He opened his eyes, and the gold in them was so bright it was practically glowing in the dark. He looked feral. I found it, he whispered. Found what? The paper? The light switch? My sanity? Your scent, he said, stepping toward me. The basement was cramped, filled with towers of toilet paper and boxes of tiny shampoo bottles, and Gideon seemed to fill every available inch of it. It's stronger down here. Without the lobby's air filtration, it's everywhere. I stepped back, my flashlight shaking slightly. Okay, we're back to the creepy stalker talk. It's lavender sanitizer, Gideon. It's $3 a bottle. I'll give you a coupon. It's not just the lavender, he growled, closing the distance until I was backed up against a stack of eco-friendly towels. He placed his hands on the boxes on either side of my head, pinning me in. It's you. It's your blood, your skin. It's the way your heart speeds up when I do this. He leaned in, his nose brushing the sensitive skin of my neck. I froze. The heat coming off him was intoxicating, a physical weight that made my knees feel like jelly. I could hear his heart beating, a slow, powerful thrum that seemed to sync up with my own. You're claiming the basement, aren't you? I whispered, my voice sounding breathy even to my own ears. This is some weird shifter marking thing. I'm reclaiming my sanity, he rasped against my skin. Everywhere you go, the noise stops. I haven't slept in 11 days, Tess. 11 days of hearing every heartbeat in a 5-mile radius. But here, with you, I could sleep for a century. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. His expression was a volatile mix of desperation and raw primal hunger. I'm not just staying in the lobby, I'm staying with you. Wherever you go, I follow. Consider me your shadow. A shadow in a neon vest, I reminded him, trying to regain my cynical edge. Very intimidating. Laugh all you want, he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble. But you're the one who hit me. You're the one who dragged me into your world. And now, I'm never letting you leave it. He suddenly reached down, his large hand wrapping around mine, the one still holding the flashlight. His grip was firm, warm, and strangely comforting. For a second, the darkness of the basement didn't seem so scary. We have work to do, Auditor, he said, his mood shifting back to that arrogant billionaire boss tone so fast it gave me whiplash. We headed back upstairs, but the lobby was no longer the quiet sanctuary I'd spent months cultivating. While I'd been downstairs, Gideon's instincts had apparently kicked in. He'd moved the heavy mahogany armchairs into a semicircle around the front desk. He'd rearranged the brochure rack so it blocked the side entrance. He'd even moved the massive decorative fern so it obscured the security camera's view of the desk. What the hell is this? I asked, staring at the redesigned lobby. It looks like a fortress. It's efficient, Gideon said, stepping behind the desk and looming over my chair. I've optimized the defensive perimeter. Now show me how to use the Night Audit software. I want to see your spreadsheets. You want to see spreadsheets? I asked, looking up at him. I want to see everything, he said, his gaze lingering on my lips. The tension was so thick I could have cut it with a letter opener. I sat down, my thigh brushing his as he leaned in to look at the screen. The slow burn was rapidly turning into a forest fire. Fine, I said, my fingers trembling as I hit the login button. But if you growl at the computer, I'm kicking you out. I don't growl at computers, he muttered, his breath hot against my ear. I only growl at things I want to mark as mine. I opened the first report, trying to focus on the numbers, but all I could think about was the man standing inches away from me. We worked in silence for an hour, a real heavy silence that was filled with the sound of our breathing and the occasional click of the mouse. Then, the main entrance doors hissed open. A woman stood there, dripping wet from the sudden midnight rain, looking absolutely terrified. She wasn't carrying luggage. She was clutching a small leather satchel to her chest, and her eyes were darting around the lobby like she was being hunted. Please, she gasped, her voice cracking. I need a room. Somewhere. Somewhere without windows. And I need it now. Gideon stiffened beside me. His hand came down on the desk, his knuckles turning white. His nostrils flared, and a low, guttural vibration started in his chest. Tess, he whispered, his voice sounding like a warning bell. "Don't check her in." "Why not?" I asked, reaching for a keycard. "She looks like she's in trouble." Gideon turned to me, his eyes full of a dark, predatory intensity I hadn't seen yet. "Because," he rasped, "she doesn't smell like a human. She smells like my rival's pack." The woman's gaze snapped to Gideon, her eyes widening in horror as she realized what he was. She turned to run, but before she could reach the door, the glass windows of the lobby shattered inward. The world didn't just break, it detonated. 1 second I was staring at a terrified woman, and the next, the front windows of the Obsidian Oasis exploded into 1,000,000 diamond-sharp shards. The sound was a physical blow, a concussive boom that rattled my teeth and sent my fight-or-flight response into a blind tailspin. I didn't have time to scream. A wall of solid, radiating heat slammed into me, driving me back toward the floor. Gideon's weight was absolute, a crushing, protective mountain of muscle that pinned me against the industrial carpet. I felt the air leave my lungs, my face pressed into the crook of his neck. He smelled like cedarwood, scorched earth, and a terrifyingly sharp metallic tang. Adrenaline. Clatter, clatter, clonk. Glass rained down on his back like hailstones on a tin roof. He didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. He just held me, his hands cupping the back of my head, shielding my face from the flying debris. "Stay down," he growled, the vibration of his voice rattling against my ribcage. Kind of hard to do anything else. I wheezed, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his chest. The woman who had run in was gone, lost in the swirling dust and shadows of the shattered lobby. Outside, the midnight rain began to blow in through the jagged gaps where the glass used to be, bringing the smell of wet pavement and ozone with it. Gideon slowly pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the darkness with a predatory focus that made my skin crawl. He looked different, larger, meaner. The neon yellow trainee vest was torn at the shoulder, revealing a hint of a dark, intricate tattoo that seemed to shift under his skin. "They're gone," he rasped, his voice dropping to a frequency that made the floorboards hum. "Who's gone? The interior decorators?" I tried to push myself up, but as soon as I shifted my weight, a white-hot spike of agony shot through my left leg. My bad knee, already aggravated from dragging Gideon's unconscious carcass earlier, finally decided it had reached its limit. "Ah, hell!" My leg buckled. I headed straight for the glass-strewn floor again, but Gideon's reflexes were faster than gravity. His hand shot out, catching me by the waist and hoisting me upward like I weighed nothing more than a bag of laundry. "You're injured," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a dark, rumbling accusation. "It's an old injury, Giddy. Surgery gone wrong. I'm fine," I lied. My teeth gritted as I tried to put weight on it. My knee felt like it was being held together by rusted staples and spite. "I just need to get to the first aid kit." "You're not walking," Gideon growled. Before I could protest, he hooked one arm under my knees and the other behind my back. He lifted me in one smooth, terrifyingly powerful motion. I gasped, my hands instinctively flying up to grab his shoulders. The heat coming off him was even more intense now, a biological furnace that seemed to soothe the ache in my leg just by proximity. Up close, his eyes weren't just gold. They were a swirling vortex of amber and copper focused on me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "Put me down! I have a lobby to clean. I have to call the insurance company. I have to—" "You have to be quiet," he interrupted, his voice a low, silky threat. "The noise is coming back, Tess. The world is getting loud again. If you keep talking, I might lose my temper, and I'm currently holding the only thing keeping me sane." He carried me toward the back office, his stride long and deceptively graceful for a man of his size. He moved like a wolf through high grass, silent, purposeful, and entirely in control of the space. He kicked the office door open and set me down in my ergonomic chair with surprising gentleness. He didn't move away. He stayed bent over me, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, trapping me in his personal space. The scent of him was everywhere, cloying, masculine, and intoxicating. My heart, which should have been slowing down now that the attack was over, was actually beating faster. "Let me see it," he commanded, his gaze dropping to my leg. "It's just a knee, Gideon. It's not dinner," I snapped, though my voice lacked its usual bite. He ignored me, sinking to one knee on the floor. The Alpha King, a man who probably had people executed for looking at him wrong, was kneeling at my feet in a torn polyester vest. He reached out, his large, warm hand hovering just above the fabric of my trousers. "I can feel the heat radiating from the inflammation," he whispered, his eyes meeting mine. "It hurts. Constantly." "It's manageable," I lied again, my voice trembling. He didn't say anything. He just placed his hand over my knee. The warmth was instantaneous, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to sink through the cloth and into the bone. The sharp, jagged pain began to dull into a heavy, manageable throb. It was like he was drawing the agony out of me and into himself. I leaned back, a long, shaky exhale escaping my lips. For a moment, the broken windows, the rival packs, and the corporate nightmare didn't matter. There was just the hum of the air conditioner, the smell of lavender and cedar, and the man at my feet who was currently my only anchor in the dark. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Gideon looked up, his thumb brushing the side of my leg in a slow, hypnotic circle. "Because you're mine to protect, Tess. And because, when I touch you, the world finally stops screaming." I opened my mouth to tell him he was crazy, to tell him that I wasn't anyone's property, but the words died in my throat. Because just as he leaned in, just as his face was inches from mine, the lobby's VIP alert buzzer let out a shrill, piercing scream. The sound of the buzzer was like a physical slap. Gideon flinched, his jaw tightening so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. The mute button effect was still working, but that buzzer was designed to cut through a hurricane. "Who?" Gideon rasped, his eyes flashing dangerously. "Is that?" "A guest," I said, my professional mask snapping back into place even as my heart continued to race. "And since my assistant is currently occupying the floor, I have to go deal with it." "You are not walking," he repeated, standing up and towering over me once more. "Watch me." I pushed off the chair, my knee feeling remarkably better, thanks to his weird voodoo heat, though still tender. I limped toward the door, Gideon trailing behind me like a very large, very annoyed shadow. We stepped back into the lobby. The rain was blowing in through the shattered windows, creating a fine mist that caught the light. Standing at the front desk, oblivious to the glass shards, the mist, or the fact that a 6'5" alpha was currently snarling at her back, was Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins was the Obsidian Oasis's resident, Karen. She stayed here once a month and spent the entire time complaining about things like the air quality and the unacceptable lack of artisanal honey at the breakfast buffet. "Excuse me," she shrieked, banging her fist on the marble counter. "Is anyone working tonight? I've been waiting for 3 minutes, and why is it so breezy in here? I demand to speak to a manager." I limped behind the desk, trying to keep a straight face. "Mrs. Higgins, as you can see, we've had a bit of a structural issue tonight. I'll be with you in just a moment." "A structural issue?" She turned, her eyes bulging as she took in the broken glass. "This is an outrage. My yoga retreat starts in 4 hours, and I cannot be expected to sleep in a building that is clearly under construction. I want a full refund, a voucher for a future stay, and—" She stopped. Her gaze had finally landed on Gideon. He was leaning against the back wall, his arms crossed over his massive chest, the neon yellow trainee vest stretched to its absolute limit. He wasn't saying a word. He was just looking at her. It wasn't a glare. It was the look a lion gives a particularly annoying gazelle. It was the alpha presence, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. And Mrs. Higgins stammered, her voice dropping 3 octaves. Who Who is this? This is Giddy, I said, pointing a thumb at him. He's my new trainee. He's still learning the customer service side of things. He's a bit literal. Gideon took a single step forward. The floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned. He loomed over the desk, his shadow swallowing Mrs. Higgins whole. The windows, Gideon rumbled, his voice like grinding stones, are broken because the world is a violent place. The air is cold because nature does not care about your yoga. You will go back to your room. You will stay there and you will not make another sound. Mrs. Higgins blinked. She looked at me, then back at the golden-eyed mountain in the yellow vest. She didn't ask for a refund. She didn't ask for artisanal honey. I think I left my lavender eye mask in my suite, she whispered. I'll just go find that. Good night. She turned and practically sprinted toward the elevators. I stared at her retreating back, then looked at Gideon. He was still standing there, radiating enough menace to end a war. You know, I said, leaning my elbows on the desk, that's generally considered poor hospitality in the employee handbook. You're supposed to offer them a warm cookie, not an existential crisis. Gideon turned his gaze to me, the intensity softening instantly. She was loud, Tess. Her voice, it was like a serrated blade against my nerves. Welcome to customer service, trainee, I sighed, gesturing to the shattered lobby. Now, since you've successfully terrified the only guest brave enough to come down here, you can help me with the cleanup. Grab the industrial broom from the closet, and try not to break it. Gideon looked at the broom closet, then back at me. I am an alpha king. I have led armies. I have negotiated treaties that saved entire species from extinction. And right now, I said, handing him a dustpan, you're a guy in a neon vest who's responsible for aisle 4. Get to work, Your Majesty. He growled, a low, frustrated sound, but he took the broom. For the next hour, the only sound in the lobby was the rhythmic swish-swish of the broom and the occasional clonk, as Gideon accidentally hit a piece of furniture with his massive frame. I watched him from the desk, my chin resting in my hand. There was something absurdly domestic about it. The billionaire Wolf King sweeping up glass in the middle of a rainstorm. The slow-burn tension from the office was still there, humming under the surface like a live wire, but it was overlaid with a strange, biting humor. You missed a spot, I called out. Gideon stopped, his knuckles whitening on the broom handle. I am going to staple you to the wall, Tess. Not without a permit, you aren't, I chirped. By 3:00 a.m., the glass was cleared. The windows were boarded up with some plywood we found in the basement, and the lobby was relatively secure. My knee was aching again, and the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me feeling hollow and exhausted. I'm hungry, I announced, pushing back from the desk. And since the kitchen is closed and we're technically in the middle of a pack war, I think it's time for the midnight buffet. A buffet? Gideon asked, looking hopeful. Steak? Roasted boar? Close, I said, standing up with a wince. Vending machine sandwiches and lukewarm coffee. Follow me, Giddy. It's time you learned how the other half lives. The break room was a grim, windowless box lit by flickering fluorescent lights that Gideon clearly hated. He stood in the doorway, his head ducking to avoid the ceiling tiles, looking like an apex predator who had accidentally wandered into a cubicle farm. This, he said, eyeing the beige linoleum and the plastic chairs, is where you spend your time. It's the height of luxury, I said, limping toward the vending machine. Now, pick your poison. We have slightly gray ham and cheese or mysterious tuna delight. Or, if you're feeling fancy, there's a bag of pretzels that expired in 2024. Gideon walked over to the machine, staring at the glowing coils like they were alien technology. How does it dispense the nourishment? You put in $2 and pray, I explained. I inserted my crumpled bills and hit the buttons for 2 ham sandwiches. The machine groaned. The coil turned with an agonizingly slow creak clunk, and our dinner tumbled into the bin. I handed him one of the plastic-wrapped triangles. Gideon looked at it with deep suspicion. He peeled back the plastic, sniffing the bread with a look of profound concentration. "It smells of preservatives and sadness," he remarked. "That's the secret ingredient," I said, taking a bite of mine. It tasted exactly like I expected. Salty, rubbery, and vaguely metallic. We sat at the small, circular table, our knees brushing in the cramped space. The proximity was a physical thing now, a heavy, warm blanket that made the dingy break room feel like the center of the universe. Gideon didn't eat his sandwich immediately. He just sat there, watching me, his eyes dark and thoughtful. "Tell me about your leg," he said suddenly. I paused mid-chew. "I told you. Old injury." "You were an athlete," he stated, his voice soft but certain. "I can see it in your posture, the way you move. Even with the limp, you have the grace of someone who used to run." I looked down at my gray ham. I was a hurdler. State championships. One bad landing, a surgeon who was having a bad day, and that was that. Now I'm the woman who yells at delivery drivers and staples billionaires. "It's a waste," Gideon rumbled, his hand reaching across the table to cover mine. His touch was electric, making the fine hairs on my arm stand up. "You have the spirit of a warrior, Tess. I see the way you fight the world, even when you're exhausted. You don't need a crown to be a queen." "And you?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation away from my own failures. "The Alpha King. Is it as glamorous as the brochures say? Or is it just a lot of roaring and expensive dry cleaning?" Gideon let out a short, dry laugh. "It's a cage. Every sense I have is dialed up to 11. I can hear a baby crying 3 blocks away. I can smell the rot in a tree a mile into the woods. The world is never quiet. It's a constant screaming assault of information. My pack, they expect me to be the strongest, the loudest, the most brutal. They don't want a man. They want a monster." He leaned in closer, the fluorescent light reflecting off the gold in his eyes. "But here, when I'm with you, the screaming stops. I don't have to be the monster. I can just be giddy." I laughed, a soft, genuine sound that seemed to startle him. "Don't let the council hear you say that. They'll take your alpha card away." "Let them," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I'd trade 1,000 kingdoms for another hour of this silence. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't about the vending machine or the broken windows anymore. It was about the way his thumb was stroking the back of my hand and the way my heart was hammering a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Gideon stood up, pulling me with him. He didn't let go of my hand. He moved around the table until he was standing directly in front of me, his massive frame blocking out the flickering light. "Tess," he whispered, his hand moving from my wrist to my cheek. His palm was rough, warm, and smelled of the cedarwood scent I'd grown to crave. I looked up at him, my breath hitching in my throat. I knew I should pull away. I knew this was a mistake, a sleep-deprived, high-stakes delusion fueled by adrenaline and shifter magic. But as he tilted his head down, his lips inches from mine, I found myself leaning in. "I'm the Night Auditor, Gideon," I breathed against his mouth. "I'm not supposed to get involved with the guests." "Then consider this," he rasped, his lips finally brushing mine, "a very thorough performance review." He kissed me. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry claim that tasted of salt, cedar, and raw, unfiltered need. It was the sound of the world finally going silent. But just as I reached up to tangle my fingers in his hair, the door to the break room slammed open. "Sire!" Gideon ripped himself away from me, his eyes glowing like twin suns as he spun toward the door. Standing there was a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his face pale and covered in a fine sheen of sweat. "Silas," Gideon growled, his voice a primal warning. This had better be life or death. "It's both," The man gasped, his eyes darting to me with a look of pure terror. The council, they've arrived, and they've brought the pack lawyers. They're filing for a status of madness, sire. They're here to take the throne. Silas stood in the break room doorway, looking like he'd just witnessed the collapse of an empire, which, considering the look on Gideon's face, wasn't far from the truth. The beta's eyes were glued to the spot where my hand was still resting on Gideon's bicep, his expression a mix of awe and pure, unadulterated terror. A status of madness? Gideon's voice was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to rattle the very cups in the vending machine. He didn't move away from me. If anything, he stepped closer, his heat branding my side. They're using the law of the quiet to move against me? They're saying you've abandoned your post for a neon-clad hallucination, sire, Silas stammered, finally dragging his gaze up to Gideon's face. The lawyers are in the lobby. They have a containment team. They think you've finally snapped from the sensory overload. I haven't snapped, Gideon growled, his hand tightening on mine. I've found the solution. We need to move, I said, my professional brain finally kicking back into gear through the haze of that kiss. If they're in the lobby, they're going to swarm the office. The back service elevator is the only way to reach the upper floors without being spotted. Gideon didn't argue. He grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the door. Silas trailed behind us like a lost puppy in a $5,000 suit, muttering about legal precedents and pack optics. We reached the service elevator, a temperamental beast that smelled of industrial floor wax and old grease. I swiped my master key, and the doors groaned open with a reluctant metal-on-metal shriek. We piled in, the space becoming instantly claustrophobic with Gideon's massive frame. I hit the button for the penthouse. The elevator lurched upward, the cables humming a strained, mechanical tune. "Gideon," I whispered, the silence of the small box pressing in on us. "If they declare you mad, what happens?" "I lose everything," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor numbers. "The title, the assets, the protection of the pack. I become a rogue." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The hum of the elevator changed from a steady drone to a stuttering, rhythmic, dying gasp. "Oh no," I breathed. "Not now. Not today." The elevator gave one final, violent jolt, and then darkness. Absolute, soul-crushing blackness. The power had cut completely. My breath hitched. The walls of the elevator seemed to shrink inward, the weight of the dark pressing against my chest like a physical hand. My heart began to hammer a frantic, uneven beat. I could feel the edges of a panic attack curling around my mind, a leftover souvenir from a childhood spent trapped in a basement during a hurricane. "Tess?" Gideon's voice was a soft rumble in the dark. I don't like the dark, Giddy," I managed to whisper, my fingers digging into his arm. "It's too quiet. It's too empty." I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me back against his chest. He was like a radiator in a cold room, his body heat seeping through my uniform and into my skin. He didn't say anything. He just held me, his chin resting on top of my head. "Listen to my heart," he murmured, his voice vibrating through his chest and into my back. "Focus on that. Forget the dark." I leaned into him, closing my eyes. His heart was a slow, powerful thud, a steady, unshakable rhythm in the void. The scent of cedar and rain-washed earth filled my senses, grounding me. The panic began to recede, replaced by a tension that was entirely different. The proximity was agonizing. I could feel every muscle in his chest, the way his breath stirred my hair, the heavy weight of his hands on my waist. The almost of the break room was still hanging between us, amplified by the isolation of the stalled elevator. Gideon's hand moved, his fingers brushing my cheek in the dark. I could hear his breath hitching, a jagged sound that told me he was just as affected as I was. "Tess," he breathed, his lips brushing my temple. The tension snapped. We leaned in, the darkness making every other sense razor-sharp. I could feel the heat of his skin, the scent of his need, the magnetic pull of his presence. And then, with a deafening clunk shriek, the power roared back to life. The elevator lurched, the overhead lights flickering on with a blinding, industrial hum. The doors slid open to reveal the 10th floor landing and a completely bewildered cleaning crew holding a stack of fresh towels. Gideon and I were tangled together, his hands still on my waist, my face flushed and inches from his. "Excuse us," I squeaked, disentangling myself with the grace of a startled cat. "Elevator maintenance, very thorough." I limped past the gaping housekeepers, my face burning, while Gideon followed with a look of pure, murderous frustration. We found a temporary sanctuary in the 11th floor laundry room, a cavernous space filled with the rhythmic thump-thump of industrial dryers and the steam-cleaned scent of bleach. Silas was leaning against a folding table, hyperventilating into his hands. "This is it," Silas moaned, his voice muffled. "The Alpha King is trapped in a laundry room with a Night Auditor and a pile of stained linens. The council is going to have a field day. They're probably already drafting the Unfit for Rule manifesto." Gideon wasn't listening. He was staring at a massive pile of unfolded pillowcases, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. "Sire?" Silas said, looking up. "What are you doing?" Gideon didn't answer. He reached out, grabbed a wrinkled pillowcase, and began to fold it. He did it with the same terrifying, focused intensity he used for everything else. His large hands moved with precision, smoothing the fabric against the table. "I'm working," Gideon growled. "Tess said the lobby doesn't audit itself. The laundry doesn't fold itself either." You're folding pillowcases," Silas whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "Sire, please, let me find a way out. I have a helicopter on standby. We can be in the mountains by dawn." "No," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I'm staying here. Every time I touch these linens, every time I help Tess with these menial tasks, the noise in my head stays quiet. If I leave, the screaming comes back. I'm not going back to the screaming, Silas." Silas turned to me, his expression desperate. You're the reason for this. You've hexed him. You've turned the King of the North into a hospitality intern." I leaned against a dryer, crossing my arms. "Hey, don't look at me. I just gave him a neon vest and a broom. If he finds inner peace in a laundry room, that's on him." "It's not inner peace, it's madness," Silas shrieked. Gideon paused, a pillowcase gripped in his hands. He turned to Silas, his eyes flashing a bright biological gold. "One more word, Silas. One more word about madness or rescue, and I will demote you to valet parking for the next 3 decades. Do I make myself clear?" Silas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Crystal, sire. Absolutely. Crystal." "Good," Gideon said, returning to his folding. "Now find a pair of scissors. This pillowcase has a loose thread and it's unacceptable." I watched them, the Alpha King obsessing over thread counts and his beta on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen, yet my heart felt strangely heavy. Gideon was giving up his world for a few hours of silence in mine. The humor of the situation was a thin veil over the looming threat. The council was downstairs, and they weren't going to wait forever. "Giddy," I said softly, stepping closer to the table. "You can't stay here. Silas is right about one thing. The longer you stay, the more power they have to take your throne." Gideon stopped. He looked at the perfectly folded pile of laundry, then at me. His expression was soft, almost vulnerable. "I don't want the throne, Tess. I just want this." "You can't have this if you're in a pack-mandated asylum," I reminded him. Suddenly, the laundry room's internal phone let out a sharp, insistent ring. I picked it up. "Front desk," I said, my voice slipping into its professional cadence. "Tess?" It was Henderson, his voice sounding like he was speaking through a mouthful of cotton. "They're here. The council. They're demanding to see Mr. Thorne. They're checking the security footage, Tess. They're heading to the elevators." I slammed the phone down. "They're coming. We need to hide. Now." "The presidential suite," I said, grabbing Gideon's hand and dragging him toward the door. It has its own dedicated soundproofing and a private service entrance. They won't think to look there first. We sprinted down the hallway, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the thick, patterned carpet. We reached the suite and I swiped my master key. The heavy mahogany doors swung open to reveal a space that was the pinnacle of luxury. Velvet drapes, a king-sized bed that looked like a cloud, and windows that looked out over the rain-slicked city. I shut the door and turned the deadbolt. The silence was instantaneous. The room was a literal sanctuary, built to keep the world out. Gideon exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. He walked into the center of the room, his shoulders finally losing some of their tension. "This," he whispered, looking around. "It's perfect." "It's 5,000 a night," I said, trying to keep the mood light. "So don't get too comfortable, you're still on the clock, trainee." We sat on the edge of the massive bed, the silence between us heavy and expectant. Without the distraction of chores or beta panics, the tension from the elevator returned tenfold. I could feel the proximity of him, the way his knee brushed mine, the scent of his skin, the raw power radiating from his body. "What happens after tonight, Tess?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "I don't know, Giddy. I go back to auditing the books and you go back to being a king, or a rogue, or whatever happens." "I don't want to go back," he said, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered on my jaw, his touch light as a feather but feeling like a brand. "I've spent my whole life being what they needed me to be. With you, I'm just a man who likes silence and stale sandwiches." I looked into his eyes, seeing the exhaustion and the hope warring within them. "You're a lot more than that, Gideon." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "Tess." Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Voices, angry, authoritative voices, were muffled by the door, but the intent was clear. "They're in the hallway," I whispered, my heart jumping into my throat. "They're checking the rooms." "Under the bed," Gideon said, his voice a quick, decisive command. "What? No, I'm the general manager in training. I don't hide under—" "Tess, move!" He grabbed my waist and practically threw me onto the floor, sliding me under the massive, velvet-skirted bed. He followed a second later, his huge frame barely fitting in the cramped space. We were pressed together, chest to chest, our legs tangled, our breath hitching in the tight confines. The door to the suite burst open. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I could see the polished black shoes of the council members through the gap in the bedskirt. "He's not here," a cold, clipped voice said. "Check the balcony, and check the bathroom. He can't have gone far. The beta is still in the laundry room." Gideon was staring at me, his face inches from mine. In the cramped, dark space under the bed, the almost was no longer an option. It was an inevitability. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer until our lips were brushing. "If we're going to be mad," he whispered against my mouth, his eyes glowing in the shadows, "we might as well make it worth the diagnosis." He kissed me, a slow, deep, soul-shattering kiss that made the world outside the bed skirt vanish completely. But as he pulled away, his hand accidentally hit the underside of the bed frame with a dull, hollow thud. The black shoes in the room stopped moving. "What was that?" the cold voice asked. "Under the bed. Check it. Now." The silence in the room was so dense you could have cut it with a room key. Above us, the polished black shoes shifted. I stopped breathing entirely. My ribs pressed so hard against Gideon's chest, I could feel every beat of his heavy, rhythmic heart. His large hand remained splayed over my chest, right above my own erratic thumping, warming me through the thin fabric of my uniform. "What was that?" the cold voice repeated, closer this time. The velvet bed skirt rustled. I could see the edge of a pristine charcoal trench coat dipping toward the carpet. My survival instinct, which had been taking a well-deserved vacation, came roaring back. I glanced at Gideon, ready to swing an elbow, but he was perfectly still. His amber eyes caught a sliver of light filtering under the mattress, glowing with a calm, predatory chill that was entirely different from the frustrated man who had been folding pillowcases. "Sir, there's nothing under there but dust," a second voice, nervous, younger, offered. "The suite has been empty for hours. The air is still." The trench coat hesitated, then pulled back. The heavy footsteps turned toward the balcony, the sound of the glass sliding open masking the soft exhale that escaped my lips. Gideon's thumb stroked the side of my ribcage, tracing the curve with agonizing slowness. "Close," he whispered, his voice a vibration against my skin that made my toes curl. "Too close." "You're the one who decided the bed was the ultimate tactical retreat," I muttered back, my voice hushed and breathy. "Next time, we're going with the linen closet." "There is no next time," he rasped, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "When they leave this room, we are going. No more hiding. No more interns and laundry." "Oh, really? And where exactly are we going at 3 a.m? The bus station?" "We're going to the root of the problem," he said, his fingers tightening slightly on my waist. "My pack's territory. It's the only place they can't touch us without a formal challenge." A formal challenge. Right, just a casual Tuesday night for a night auditor. Above us, the balcony door slid shut. The footsteps retreated toward the main door, and then the suite fell completely silent as the heavy mahogany clicked shut and locked. We stayed under the bed for 3 full minutes, not moving, wrapped around each other in the dark. The heat radiating from him was a physical wall, thick and intoxicating. I could smell the cedar and rain-drenched earth, a sharp contrast to the stale, sanitized air of the suite. "Okay, the coast is clear," I whispered, wiggling slightly to get some space. "You can let go now." "I don't think I will," he murmured, his face buried in the crook of my neck. "Gideon, I'm serious. My knee is cramping, and if I have to spend the rest of my shift on the floor, I am billing you for ergonomic damages." He let out a low, rumbly chuckle that vibrated right through me. He shifted, his broad shoulders easily slipping out from beneath the bed frame, and then he reached down, easily pulling me out and up onto my feet. The sudden release of his proximity left me feeling strangely cold. "Come," he said, holding out a hand. "We need to go before they realize the room wasn't actually empty." I looked at his hand, large, strong, and covered in faint calluses. I took it, feeling the electric shock of skin against skin. The night was far from over. We moved through the service corridor behind the elevators, a limping auditor and a billionaire in a torn neon vest, followed by Silas, who was currently checking his watch every 5 seconds. The corridor smelled like ozone and old vacuum bags, the dim yellow lights flickering with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. "The service stairs are just ahead," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "But the council has a security detail on the ground floor. If we take the elevator, the sensor will alert them immediately." "Then we take the stairs," Gideon said, not breaking his stride. He kept his hand firmly on the small of my back, guiding me with an insistent, possessive pressure. Every time his hand brushed my uniform, my pulse spiked. The slow-burn tension was no longer simmering. It was boiling over, making it difficult to remember that I was an underpaid employee, and he was an alpha king. "We're going to get caught," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm to hide the fluttering in my stomach. "We can just tell them we were doing a deep dive into the hotel's plumbing." Gideon didn't look back. They wouldn't understand. The council only understands 2 things: power and submission. And right now, they think we're weak. "Well, I'm definitely weak," I groaned as my knee gave a sharp, grinding twinge. "Can we, I don't know, take a 5-second break? I'm running on 3 hours of sleep and a ham sandwich that tastes like rubber." Gideon stopped. He turned to face me in the dim light of the stairwell landing. The proximity was overwhelming. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, the heat of his breath brushing my cheek. "You aren't weak, Tess," he whispered, his amber eyes flashing with a possessive, golden fire. You've held this place together. You've kept me from losing my mind. If that isn't strength, I don't know what is." I stared at him, my breath hitching in my throat. I opened my mouth to make a joke, to tell him he was being dramatic, but the words died as his thumb gently brushed a smudge of dust from my cheek. The silence in the stairwell was heavy, broken only by the hum of the distant ventilation system. "Sire," Silas hissed from the landing below. "They're on the second-floor landing. We have to go." Gideon didn't pull away immediately. He let his fingers linger on my jaw, his gaze holding mine captive in the flickering light. "We will finish this later," he promised, his voice a low, dark growl. He turned and led the way down the metal steps, his hand never leaving my side. We reached the heavy fire door leading to the parking garage. Gideon pressed his palm against the metal, looking out into the damp, rainy night. The garage was dark, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the security lights. But something was wrong. The air outside didn't smell like rain anymore. It smelled of musk, danger, and too many wolves in a small space. "They're waiting for us," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low-frequency hum. We stepped out into the damp chill of the underground garage, the sound of our shoes clicking against the concrete echoing in the cavernous space. The rain beat a rhythmic, muffled drum on the ceiling above. In the center of the exit lane stood 3 figures in perfectly tailored charcoal gray suits. They looked like an executive board meeting, except for the way they stood. Weight forward, eyes glowing in the gloom with the faint, unsettling amber of a pack that didn't know the meaning of the word rest. Gideon, the leader, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a face like carved stone, stepped forward. "The council has reached its decision. The status of madness is confirmed. You will return to the Pack's territory to stand trial." "I am not mad, Vance," Gideon replied. His voice was a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the oxygen from the garage. He didn't drop his hand from my back, keeping me firmly within his protective reach. Vance's gaze flickered down to where Gideon was touching me, his upper lip curling in disgust. "An Omega? A human employee? Is this the silence you've been hiding behind, sire? You've abandoned your post for a biological sedative? Watch your mouth," Gideon growled, stepping forward so quickly he seemed to teleport across the concrete. He loomed over the older man, radiating enough heat to melt the frost on the cars nearby. "She is under my protection." "She is a liability," Vance sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to Gideon's glowing ones. "The Pack cannot have an Alpha King who relies on a human. We have the papers. We have the vote." Silas hovered behind us, muttering prayers in a pitch only dogs could hear. I looked at the 3 wolves, then up at Gideon's broad, tense back. My mind raced. The power imbalance was staggering, but as I looked at the man, I didn't see the Alpha King. I just saw the man who had folded pillowcases and shared a horrible sandwich with me. I stepped out from behind his back, my bad knee throbbing with a sharp, defiant pulse. "Excuse me," I said, my voice echoing in the garage. "Do you have any idea how much it costs to replace a plate glass window? Because if you're planning on a pack war, the Obsidian Oasis is going to bill your corporate account for the damages." Vance blinked, looking at me like I was an alien life form. "What?" I snapped, taking a step forward and raising the swing-line stapler I'd kept in my pocket. "The bill is going to be astronomical, and before you try anything, trainee here has been practicing his customer service, and he's feeling very literal tonight." Gideon let out a short, sharp bark of laughter that broke the tension, a dark, dangerous sound. "You heard the auditor," Gideon said, turning his golden eyes on the 3 executives. "Clear the exit, Vance. We're leaving." Vance's jaw tightened. He raised his hand, and the 2 wolves beside him stepped forward, their muscles bunching as they prepared to shift. The garage fell dead silent. Then Gideon let out a growl, a deep, chest-shaking roar that sounded like the earth splitting in 2. The power of it was absolute, forcing the 3 executives to their knees in submission. "Now," Gideon whispered. the sound vibrating through the wet concrete. He grabbed my hand, pulling me toward his sleek black car parked near the exit, the slow-burn tension between us now a live wire ready to detonate. The headlights were a blinding, clinical white, cutting through the garage's gloom and pinning us against the sleek metal of Gideon's sedan. I squinted, raising a hand to shield my eyes while Gideon shifted instantly. He didn't just step in front of me, he became a shield, his massive shoulders blocking out the glare. I could feel the heat rolling off him in waves, a literal furnace of protective rage. The vehicle blocking the ramp wasn't a sleek executive town car. It was a rugged, mud-splattered SUV, the engine idling with a low, irregular rattle that sounded like a predator purring. "Gideon!" a voice called out, not from the SUV, but from the shadows to our left. A woman stepped into the light. She was tall, dressed in tactical gear that looked far too functional for a resort lobby, and her hair was a shock of silver white that shimmered under the orange security lights. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like a huntress. "Merrick," Gideon rasped, his voice dropping to that jagged, gravelly depth. "I thought you were still tracking the dissidents in the Cascades." "I was," she said, her eyes flicking to me with a clinical, icy detachment. "Until the council sent out a Priority 1 alert, claiming the king had been compromised by a specialized dampener." "I'm not a dampener," I snapped, peering around Gideon's bicep. "I'm a Night Auditor, and if you're here to join the Gideon is Crazy Club, the line starts behind the guys in the suits." Merrick's gaze sharpened, her nostrils flaring. She took a step closer, and I felt Gideon's hand reach back, finding my wrist. His grip was firm, possessive, the calluses of his palm grazing my pulse point. His touch was the only thing keeping my knees from buckling. "She's the one," Merrick whispered, her voice tinged with a strange mix of awe and suspicion. The noise. It's dead around her. Even from here, I can feel the static dropping. "She stays with me," Gideon growled, the sound vibrating through the concrete floor. "Move the truck, Merrick. This isn't a request." Merrick didn't move. She looked at the SUV, then back at us. "The council didn't just send me to fetch you, Gideon. They sent the enforcers. If you don't leave with me right now, voluntarily, they're authorized to use the silver-laced containment. They don't care if you're the king, they care that you're broken." Gideon's fingers tightened on my wrist. I could feel his internal struggle, the king versus the man who just wanted 5 minutes of peace. The slow-burn tension between us was a physical weight now, a cord stretched to the snapping point. "Tess," he murmured, leaning his head back toward mine, his breath hot against my ear. "Get in the car, lock the doors." "And leave you out here to play Alpha of the Hill?" I whispered back. "Not a chance, Giddy. I still haven't clocked out." "Tess," he warned, his voice a low, dark caress. "Now." The SUV didn't move, but Gideon didn't wait. He didn't go for the driver's side. Instead, he scooped me up again and ignored my indignant squawk as he threw me into the passenger seat. He followed a split second later, the car groaning under his weight as he slammed it into reverse. "Gideon, the exit is blocked!" Silas shrieked from the back seat, having apparently teleported into the car in a fit of self-preservation. "I'm aware, Silas," Gideon snapped. He didn't head for the ramp. He headed for the loading dock, a steep, narrow incline designed for box trucks and delivery vans. The sedan's underside scraped against the concrete with a horrific, metal-on-metal scream that made my teeth ache. "My car!" I cried, looking back at the parking spot where my beat-up hatchback sat. "If they scratch my paint, I'm holding you personally liable." "I'll buy you a fleet of them," Gideon growled, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. We burst out of the garage and into the torrential rain of the city. The streets were slick, reflecting the neon signs of late-night diners and pharmacies. Gideon drove like he was navigating a battlefield, fast, aggressive, and with a terrifyingly precise intuition. The silence of the car was heavy. The only sound was the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers and the heavy, synchronized breathing of the three of us. Gideon reached over, his hand finding mine on the center console. He didn't look at me, but his thumb began to stroke the back of my hand, a slow, grounding motion. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The sanctuary," he said. "It's an old estate on the edge of the city. High walls, no electronics, no noise. It's the only place the council can't legally enter without a warrant from the High Elder." "And after that?" Gideon finally looked at me, his eyes glowing amber in the dark cabin. The intensity in them was enough to make my heart skip a beat. "After that, I find out why you're the only thing that makes the world stop screaming." We pulled off the main road and onto a gravel path that wound through a dense thicket of pines. The trees pressed in on us, their wet branches slapping against the windows. The city lights faded, replaced by a deep, ancient darkness. The sanctuary loomed out of the mist, a massive, Gothic pile of stone and ivy that looked like it belonged in a Victorian horror novel. Gideon killed the engine, and the world went suddenly, unnervingly still. "We're here," he said, letting go of my hand to open his door. The air outside was cold and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Gideon walked around to my side, opening the door and offering me his hand. I took it, stepping out onto the uneven ground. My knee gave a sharp, painful twinge, and I stumbled. Gideon caught me, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. The proximity was staggering. The heat of him, the scent of cedar and rain, the way his heart hammered against mine. "I've got you," he whispered, his lips brushing my forehead. The interior of the sanctuary was like stepping back in time. No LED lights, no humming refrigerators, no buzzing security systems. Just the faint, warm glow of beeswax candles and the crackle of a fire already burning in the massive stone hearth. "Silas," Gideon said, not looking away from me. "Check the perimeter. Ensure the wards are active." "On it, sire," Silas muttered, scurrying off into the shadows of the foyer, looking immensely relieved to be away from the tension radiating between Gideon and me. Gideon led me toward the fireplace. The room was filled with heavy, comfortable furniture, leather armchairs, wool blankets, and shelves of real physical books. It was the anti-resort. It was human. "Sit," he commanded gently, guiding me to a sofa near the fire. He knelt before me, just as he had in the office, and began to unlace my sensible work shoes. I watched him, my breath catching. The Alpha King, the man who moved empires, was carefully peeling off my soggy socks. "You're shivering," he noted, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "It's just the rain," I lied. It wasn't the rain. It was the way his hands felt on my skin. Large, warm, and deceptively gentle. It was the way he looked at me, not as a tool or a sedative, but as something precious. He reached for a thick Hudson Bay blanket and draped it over my shoulders, tucking the edges around me until I was a wool-covered burrito. Then he sat on the floor at my feet, leaning his back against the sofa, his head resting near my knee. "Talk to me, Tess," he whispered. "Tell me something. Anything. Just keep the noise away." I don't know what to say, Giddy. I'm just a girl who's good at math and bad at picking boyfriends." He let out a soft laugh. "I think your taste in men just got a very significant upgrade." I smiled, my hand instinctively reaching out to rest on his shoulder. The fabric of his shirt was damp, the muscles beneath it hard as granite. We sat there for a long time, the only sound the popping of the logs in the fireplace. The slow-burn tension was still there, but it had shifted into something deeper, something that felt dangerously like comfort. "Gideon," I said softly. "Why me? There are millions of humans. Why does my scent work?" He turned his head, his cheek resting against the blanket on my lap. He looked up at me, his eyes dark and vulnerable. "I don't know, Tess. Maybe the universe decided I'd suffered enough. Or maybe—" He stopped, his head snapping toward the heavy oak front doors. A low, mournful howl echoed through the trees outside, a sound that was neither human nor wolf. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated grief. Gideon stood up, his body instantly tense, his hand reaching for the heavy iron poker by the fire. "They didn't send the enforcers, Tess," he whispered, his face turning pale. "They sent the banshee." The mist didn't just crawl, it poured. It was a thick, viscous gray that looked less like water vapor and more like liquid shadow, pooling across the floorboards with a predatory intent. As it touched the heavy oak legs of the sofa, the wood let out a faint, agonized creak, as if the very presence of the fog was leaching the life out of the furniture. One by one, the beeswax candles died, not with a flicker, but with a sudden, violent snap, as if an invisible hand had pinched the wicks. The only light remaining was the dying orange pulse of the embers in the hearth, casting long, distorted shadows of Gideon against the stone walls. "Giddy," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the sudden cold. "The mist, it's moving toward us." Gideon didn't answer with words. He stepped back, his massive frame shielding me as he retreated toward the sofa. He didn't sit. He hovered, one hand reaching back to find mine through the layers of the wool blanket. His palm was blistering hot, a stark, burning contrast to the supernatural chill that was currently turning my breath into a fine white plume in the air. "Don't breathe it in," he warned, his voice a low-frequency vibration that I felt more in my marrow than in my ears. "The banshee's breath. It doesn't just herald death, Tess. It feeds on the memory of why you wanted to live." "Great," I muttered, my teeth beginning to chatter despite the blanket. "So it's a Dementor with a better publicist." Just what my Tuesday shift was missing. The howling outside changed. It dropped from a mournful wail to a rhythmic, pulsing thrum, a sound that felt like it was trying to sync up with my heartbeat. Every time the sound peaked, a fresh wave of that gray mist surged under the door, rising higher, swirling around Gideon's ankles. He growled, a deep, visceral sound that seemed to push the mist back a few inches. He was fighting it with his sheer presence, his alpha weight acting as a physical barrier. But I could see the strain in his shoulders. The neon yellow vest, now a shredded, pathetic rag, clung to his damp shirt, highlighting the way his muscles were bunched into knots. "Silas!" Gideon roared, his voice cracking the oppressive silence. "Where are the iron salts?" There was no answer. The back of the house was a void of gray fog. "Silas is likely incapacitated," Gideon rasped, his gaze never leaving the door. "The banshee targets the weak-willed first. He's probably currently convinced he's failing his performance review in a loop." "Wait," I said, a sudden thought striking through the cold. "If she feeds on memories, and my whole thing is quieting the noise, maybe I'm the counter-frequency?" Gideon turned his head slightly, his amber eyes searching mine in the gloom. The gold was swirling now, bright and desperate. "Tess, no. You're human. Your mind isn't built to withstand a psychic vacuum. If you open yourself up to that wail, it will hollow you out." "I'm already hollowed out, Giddy," I snapped, trying to find my cynical armor. "I've been working the night shift for 3 years. My soul is mostly coffee and spite. I can handle a little fog." The mist reached the edge of the sofa, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I felt a wave of sudden, crushing sorrow, a memory of my knee popping on the track, the sound of the doctor's voice saying, "Never again," the smell of the hospital's floor wax. It was heavy. It was suffocating. Gideon's hand tightened on mine. He pulled me closer, dragging me off the sofa and into the circle of his arms. He wrapped the blanket and himself around me, creating a small, warm pocket of reality in the middle of the nightmare. "Stay with me," he whispered, his lips against my hair. "Listen to my heart. Only my heart." I pressed my ear against his chest. It was a sledgehammer, steady, powerful, and defiant. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and that sharp, metallic alpha tang filled my lungs, pushing out the gray mist. "You're a very expensive radiator," I breathed. my hands clutching the front of his damp shirt. "I'm a king in a parking vest, Tess. Try to keep the respect in your voice." A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the room. The heavy oak front door didn't open, it disintegrated, not into splinters, but into dust. Standing in the threshold was a figure that seemed to be made entirely of tattered gray silk. She had no face, only a void where features should be, and her fingers were long, translucent needles that twitched in the cold air. She didn't walk. She drifted, the mist rising up to meet her as she entered the sanctuary. The wail she let out wasn't a sound. It was a physical force. It hit us like a tidal wave, slamming us back against the sofa. The embers in the fireplace died instantly, plunging us into total darkness. Gideon let out a roar of pure, unadulterated agony. The noise he had spent the night running from, the psychic screaming of the world, was being amplified by the banshee, turned into a weapon and funneled directly into his brain. He collapsed to his knees, his hands flying to his head, his body shaking with the force of the assault. "Gideon!" I screamed, but I couldn't even hear my own voice. The banshee drifted closer, her needle fingers reaching out for him. She wanted the king. She wanted the brightest light in the room to extinguish. I didn't think. I didn't have time for a risk assessment. I lunged forward, throwing myself between Gideon and the gray figure. I reached out and grabbed those translucent, freezing hands with my own. The cold was absolute. It felt like my blood was turning to slush. But as the banshee's essence poured into me, something happened. The quiet. The same biological dampener that made the world go silent for Gideon worked on her too. The banshee wasn't a creature of silence. She was a creature of discord. And I was a giant, human-shaped mute button. The gray mist began to stutter. The wail turned into a confused, static-filled hiss. The figure slowed, her void face tilting as if trying to understand why her weapon was failing. "You're too loud," I wheezed, my fingers trembling as I held onto her. "And I hate loud guests." I felt a surge of Gideon's heat behind me. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was standing. I could feel the gold of his eyes burning through the back of my head. He reached around me, his large hands overlapping mine on the banshee's wrists. "My turn," he growled. The gold light didn't just glow, it exploded. Gideon funneled every ounce of his alpha power, every bit of the frustration and the need he'd felt all night, through my dampening field and directly into the creature. It was like a lightning bolt hitting a cloud. The banshee didn't scream. She simply dissolved. One second, she was a nightmare of gray silk, and the next, she was nothing more than a few stray threads of mist evaporating in the morning light that was just beginning to bleed through the shattered doorway. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, psychic silence of the banshee or the frantic quiet of our hiding spots. It was the silence of a room after a storm. Gideon didn't let go of my hands. He stood behind me, his chest pressed to my back, his breathing ragged and heavy. The quiet was still there, thrumming between us, but it was no longer a shield. It was a bridge. "Tess," he whispered, his voice sounding raw. I turned in his arms, my knees feeling like they were made of water. I looked up at him, my Night Auditor uniform a mess, my hair a disaster, and my left knee officially retired from service. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had looked into the abyss and found a reason to climb back out. "The sun is up," I said, nodding toward the doorway. Gideon looked at the horizon, where the first fingers of gold were touching the pine trees. Then he looked back at me, a slow, devastatingly handsome smirk spreading across his face. "It is," he said. "And I believe your shift is officially over." "Does that mean I get my overtime pay?" "It means," he said, leaning down until his nose brushed mine, "that you're coming with me. The council is still waiting, and I think it's time they met the new Night Auditor of the North." I was about to ask what the dental plan was like for a queen, but the sound of gravel crunching outside cut me off. A black SUV, armored, sleek, and flying the official seal of the High Elder, screeched to a halt in front of the ruins of the door. The door opened, and a man in a white suit stepped out, holding a silver scroll. "Gideon Thorne," he called out, his voice booming through the trees. "The status of madness has been rescinded, but a new charge has been brought against you." Gideon stiffened, his hand moving to the small of my back. "On what grounds?" The man in white looked at me, then at the shredded neon vest still hanging off Gideon's shoulder. "The charge of high treason, for attempting to bond with a human without the council's blessing."